were, but I didn't think there was anything unusual about it. I just assumed that everybody, this is what happened in everybody's house. It wasn't until I went over to my friend.
On December 14th, 2025, Hollywood didn't erupt into chaos. It went quiet. Not the loud, panicked kind of silence that follows headlines, but the kind that settles slowly, as if people instinctively knew this wasn't a story meant to be consumed quickly. Inside a private home in Brentwood, Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were found gone. No public struggle, no dramatic scene spilling into the street. Just an ending that arrived without permission. For a man whose films were built on warmth, connection, and imperfect families trying to hold together, the stillness felt wrong. This wasn't how his stories ended. And yet, this one did. What made it even heavier was not just how they were found, but how little noise the world heard before it happened. And that silence would soon become the most disturbing detail of all. That Sunday afternoon unfolded like countless others in Brentwood. The streets were calm. The houses stood quietly behind gates and hedges, built for privacy, designed to keep the world out. Nothing about the Reiner residence suggested urgency. No neighbors reported raised voices. No alarms were triggered. Sunlight passed through the neighborhood as usual, giving no hint that time had already stopped inside one home. It wasn't until concern turned into action, when family members arrived, that the truth surfaced. 2 lives, gone behind closed doors. What stunned responders wasn't just the loss, but the absence of chaos. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing suggested a break-in. It felt less like a crime scene and more like a place that had simply fallen silent. And that unnatural calm immediately raised a question no one wanted to ask yet. When authorities entered the home, what they didn't see mattered as much as what they did. The doors were intact. The windows showed no damage. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that someone had rushed in or fled. This wasn't a space that looked invaded. It looked sealed. Investigators noted injuries that made it impossible to dismiss the situation as natural, but the environment offered no obvious external suspect. No broken glass, no ransacked rooms, no trail leading outward. In cases like this, investigators usually widen their search. Here, they did the opposite. With no evidence pointing outside, attention was forced inward, toward the people who had access, toward the relationships that existed behind those walls. And that shift changed everything. By evening, the case was transferred to the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division. The classification was careful, deliberate, an apparent homicide. No more, no less. At the press briefing, officials offered almost nothing. No suspect named, no theory shared. Just the confirmation that the investigation was active. For the public, that restraint didn't calm anything. It did the opposite. Silence has a way of expanding, filling gaps with speculation. And when law enforcement avoids direction, people search for patterns themselves. The Reiner family released a brief statement requesting privacy. No explanations, no clarifications, just grief. For a man who had spent his life in dialogue, with audiences, with politics, with culture, the absence of words at the end felt haunting. And it left space for questions that had nowhere else to go. At 78, Rob Reiner had nothing left to prove. His work had long moved beyond awards into memory. Films that felt personal even to people who had never met him. Stories that lingered because they understood something simple and painful, that love doesn't always fix what's broken. In the hours after the news spread, tributes arrived slowly, thoughtfully. Not celebrating achievements, but remembering presence. How safe he made sets feel. How carefully he listened. How much humanity he placed between the lines. And yet, This ending refused to behave like a tribute. It didn't wrap his life in meaning. It interrupted it. And as people processed what had been lost, another truth began to surface quietly. This wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was the final chapter of a struggle that had been unfolding for years, mostly unseen. Hollywood is used to loss, but this one landed differently. There were no dramatic memorial specials, no frantic media scramble. Instead, something subtler happened. People paused. Messages appeared slowly, written with care, as if rushing would somehow disrespect the weight of what had occurred. What many noticed immediately was what wasn't mentioned: numbers, accolades, rankings. Instead, colleagues spoke about presence, about calm, about trust. In an industry driven by urgency, Rob Reiner had been someone who slowed things down. And now, his absence created the same effect. It wasn't disbelief that spread, it was reflection. And as the tributes continued, a pattern emerged that hinted at why this loss felt so personal to so many. Actors didn't describe being pushed or commanded. They described being believed in. One spoke about how Rob never raised his voice, never rushed a moment. Another remembered how he would step back just before a scene, letting silence do the work. That detail came up again and again. Silence. Not emptiness, but intention. It explained why his films lingered. Stories like When Harry Met Sally or Stand By Me didn't tell audiences what to feel. They trusted viewers to arrive there on their own. And now, people realized something unsettling. The man who mastered restraint in storytelling had lived his private life the same way, carrying burdens without broadcasting them. And one of those burdens had been quietly shaping his final years. Rewatching Rob Reiner's films after the tragedy brought a strange realization. Nearly all of them revolve around connection under strain. Families trying to hold together. Friends confronting loss. People loving each other while knowing love may not be enough. At the time, these themes felt universal. Now, they felt intimate, almost confessional. It became difficult to separate art from life, especially knowing that behind the warmth of those stories was a man spending years worrying about something he could not control. The idea that someone so skilled at shaping hopeful endings lived without one himself was hard to ignore. And that contrast, the light on screen, the weight off it, made people look backward, searching for where the fracture began. For years, Rob Reiner lived with a tension that never resolved. Not professionally, personally. The kind that doesn't explode, but simmers. He didn't hide it out of shame, he hid it out of protection. Those close to him knew he carried constant concern for his son, a cycle of hope followed by setback. There was no dramatic intervention moment, no clean recovery arc, just waiting. Waiting for stability, waiting for reassurance, waiting for the phone not to ring. It was the opposite of cinematic. And maybe that's why it stayed out of view. But when tragedy arrived, that long, unresolved struggle suddenly became impossible to ignore. As the investigation remained quiet, attention shifted almost instinctively. Not because of evidence, because of history. Nick Reiner had lived much of his life outside the protective glow of his family's reputation. His struggles were known, discussed openly years earlier, and then largely forgotten. Until now. No accusations were made, no conclusions drawn. But the context was there, and context has weight. In cases without answers, people search for narratives that already exist. And Nick's story, long unfinished, was suddenly reread through a darker lens. What had once been seen as a battle for survival was now viewed with unease. And just like that, a family tragedy became something far more complicated. Nick Reiner's story never followed the arc people expect from a Hollywood family. Born into comfort, he still drifted early, away from structure, away from stability, and eventually away from home itself. By his mid-teens, addiction had already taken hold, and from there, time stopped moving forward in any clean direction. Periods of improvement collapsed into relapse. Temporary housing gave way to homelessness. The last name that opened doors for others became something he tried to escape. Not out of rebellion, but exhaustion. Before we go further, if stories that explore the real, unpolished truths behind Hollywood lives matter to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep these stories alive. And as you listen, ask yourself this: can a family do everything right and still lose the fight? That question followed Rob Reiner for years, even when no one else could see it. In 2016, Nick did something unexpected. He spoke. Not to defend himself, not to shift blame, but to admit failure openly. In a rare interview, he described addiction not as chaos, but as erosion, the slow loss of trust, time, and identity. What hurt him most wasn't what he endured, but what he caused his parents to endure. He spoke about guilt in a way that felt permanent, not temporary. Rob Reiner didn't interrupt that narrative or soften it. He stood beside his son publicly, not as a fixer, but as a witness. It was an uncomfortable honesty, one Hollywood usually avoids. And once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. The story was out there, unfinished. That unfinished story became the foundation for Being Charlie. On the surface, it was a film about addiction. Beneath that, it was something far more personal. Rob Reiner didn't try to solve the problem through storytelling. He exposed it. The film doesn't reward recovery. It doesn't promise redemption. It simply shows love failing to cure what it desperately wants to. For many viewers, it felt bleak. For Rob, it was honest. A way of saying what he could never control. And once that truth was placed on screen, it lingered. Because real life never offered a final act to follow. After the film, nothing resolved. There was no turning point, no breakthrough. Just time passing unevenly. Rob and Michelle lived in a constant state of cautious hope, the kind that doesn't celebrate progress because it has learned how fragile progress can be. Friends noticed how careful they became with optimism, how joy was always measured. That kind of waiting wears people down quietly. It doesn't announce itself, it simply stays. And when tragedy struck, that long history didn't disappear. It resurfaced, not as proof, not as accusation, but as a reminder that some stories never close cleanly. When the investigation stalled publicly, the media didn't invent a new narrative. It reopened an old one. Nick Reiner wasn't named by police. No charges were filed, no statements were issued, but silence, paired with history, has gravity. Reporters revisited past interviews. Commentators reread earlier confessions through a harsher lens. What had once been framed as recovery became uncertainty, and Nick himself remained unseen. No response, no appearance. That absence explained nothing, but it echoed the same distance that had defined much of his life. And suddenly, the tragedy wasn't just about what happened inside the house. It was about everything that had been unresolved long before that day. Rob Reiner entered the world carrying a name that already belonged to everyone else. His father, Carl Reiner, wasn't just successful. He was foundational. American comedy after World War II was shaped by his voice, his timing, his ability to make intelligence feel effortless. To outsiders, that legacy looked like protection. Inside the family, it felt like weight. Rob wasn't compared to other children. He was compared to a standard already written into cultural memory. Every achievement arrived pre-measured. Every misstep felt amplified. He didn't struggle for opportunity. He struggled for ownership, for the right to be seen as something other than Carl Reiner's son. That kind of pressure doesn't announce itself as trauma. It embeds quietly, shaping how a person doubts, works, and proves. And for Rob, that need to justify his place never fully disappeared. When Rob Reiner found success on television, it came faster than certainty. His role as Mike Stivic on All in the Family made him recognizable, influential, and loved. But success has a way of narrowing perception. To the industry, Rob became a type, sharp, outspoken, comedic, useful in front of the camera, limited behind it. When he began expressing interest in directing, the reaction wasn't hostile, it was dismissive. People smiled, they nodded, and they didn't take him seriously. Years later, Rob admitted that period taught him a painful truth. Being liked doesn't mean being trusted. And trust, in Hollywood, is harder to earn than applause. That lesson stayed with him. It taught him restraint, patience, and a habit of letting work speak when words failed. Rob Reiner didn't wait for permission. In 1984, he directed This Is Spinal Tap, a project many initially misunderstood. Some thought it was a joke that wouldn't last. Others didn't know what to make of it at all. But Rob wasn't chasing validation. He was testing himself in public. The film worked not because it was loud, but because it trusted the audience to notice details. Absurdity revealed through stillness. Humor that didn't explain itself. That approach became his signature. Film after film followed, each different in genre, but united by restraint. He didn't demand attention. He earned it slowly. And for the first time, people stopped introducing him by his father's name. But even as that shadow faded professionally, it never vanished internally. At his peak, Rob Reiner directed stories that felt intimate, even when they were widely loved. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men. None relied on spectacle. They relied on people, on hesitation, on moral uncertainty. That wasn't accidental. Rob gravitated toward characters who felt caught between expectation and reality, because that space was familiar. Even at the height of acclaim, he didn't describe himself as fulfilled. He described himself as careful. Success hadn't erased doubt. It had simply made it quieter. And when doubt goes quiet, it doesn't leave. It waits. By the late 1990s, Hollywood began changing its rhythm. Louder films, faster cycles, new voices. Rob Reiner didn't fall. He faded. Offers arrived less urgently. Meetings stopped revolving around his name. There was no scandal to explain it. No failure dramatic enough to debate. Just a slow repositioning, from center to edge. That kind of shift is uniquely painful, because nothing ends. It just stops being held open. Rob later described it as standing outside a room he once belonged to, watching the lights stay on. And it was in that quieter phase, professionally and emotionally, that his life narrowed back to what mattered most: family, responsibility, and a private struggle that never gave him the ending his films so often searched for. In the years that followed, Rob Reiner slowly transformed in the public eye, not by changing his films, but by changing his voice. As America entered a period of deep division, Rob chose not to remain neutral. He spoke clearly, repeatedly, and without softening his position. For some, this was courage. For others, it became a line they were no longer willing to cross. What's important is what didn't happen. Rob didn't turn his movies into speeches. He didn't rewrite his past to fit the moment. Yet the distance grew anyway. His name, once associated almost exclusively with humane storytelling, became tied to contemporary debate. Studios grew cautious. Conversations shifted. The art stayed the same, but the ears listening to it changed. And for a man who had spent decades trusting audiences to meet him halfway, that quiet withdrawal felt heavier than rejection. It wasn't anger that followed him, it was hesitation. In 2020, Rob Reiner passed away at 98. To the public, it was the graceful closing of a legendary life. To Rob, it was something far more destabilizing. Carl had been many things: mentor, example, standard, but most of all, he had been there. Even when Rob doubted himself, Carl's presence acted as a quiet anchor. After the funeral, Rob admitted something few people expect to hear from a man in his 70s. He said he felt orphaned, not because he lacked family, but because the one person who made him feel unmeasured was gone. For the first time, there was no shadow behind him. And without it, there was also no shelter. He stood fully alone, later in life than most people ever do. After losing his father, Rob Reiner didn't try to fill the space that was left behind. He didn't rush back into relevance or attempt to reclaim the attention he once commanded so easily. Instead, his life entered a quieter rhythm, one that didn't announce itself. Projects came and went without spectacle. Interviews became rarer and more introspective. When he spoke, it wasn't about what he planned next, but about what he had already lived through. He sounded less like a man looking forward and more like someone taking inventory of time, of memory, of what remains when ambition no longer leads the way. There was no bitterness in that shift, but there was clarity. Rob understood something many people only realize too late: that relevance is temporary, but responsibility is not. And the responsibility he carried most heavily had nothing to do with film. It lived at home. It lived in worry. It lived in the quiet knowledge that love does not always translate into rescue. His son's struggle never reached a final chapter, and Rob learned to live alongside that uncertainty rather than demand an ending that life refused to provide. Professionally, he continued working, but without urgency. He didn't chase the spotlight because he no longer needed it to confirm who he was. The industry had moved on, and he accepted that without protest. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that fighting time is a losing battle. What mattered now was presence, consistency, being there even when outcomes remained unclear. This phase of Rob Reiner's life wasn't defined by decline, but by restraint. He didn't disappear. He stepped back. And in doing so, he embodied the very lessons his films had always suggested: that not every story requires a climax, and not every life needs an encore to be complete. Some chapters don't resolve. They simply continue until they don't. When the news finally surfaced, it didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived with absence. Rob Reiner and his wife were gone, and the world was left staring at a story that offered no immediate shape, no clean narrative to hold on to. There was no explanation strong enough to quiet the questions. No sequence of events that fit comfortably into the way tragedies are usually processed. And perhaps that is what made it so unsettling. This wasn't an ending that resolved anything. It exposed how little control even the most thoughtful lives truly have. For decades, Rob Reiner had built stories around a simple, painful truth: that love is powerful, but not omnipotent. His films rarely promised salvation. They showed people trying, sometimes failing, often continuing anyway. And in the most uncomfortable way possible, his own life echoed that same structure. Not as metaphor, as fact. There was no scandal attached to his final chapter. no dramatic downfall to dissect. What remained instead was silence, and silence is harder to sit with than outrage. It doesn't offer villains. It doesn't satisfy curiosity. It forces reflection. Friends and admirers searched for meaning, but meaning refused to announce itself. The tragedy didn't feel like punishment or consequence. It felt arbitrary. And that randomness is what lingered longest. What made the loss heavier was the sense that this story had been carrying unresolved weight for years. A family living alongside uncertainty. A father accepting that some battles cannot be won, only endured. A man who understood restraint so deeply that even in death, nothing was spelled out. No final message. No clarifying revelation. Just the sudden removal of two people who had spent their lives quietly holding things together. And in that way, the ending became painfully honest. It didn't betray the themes Rob Reiner spent his career exploring. It fulfilled them, not with comfort, but with truth. Some stories don't close cleanly. They stop mid-thought. And those are the ones that stay with us the longest. In the end, Rob Reiner did not leave behind a mystery meant to be solved. He left behind a life meant to be understood slowly. A life built on listening rather than demanding, on patience rather than noise. His films remain, still playing in living rooms, still reminding people of who they were when they first saw them. But beyond the screen, what lingers most is something quieter. A man who believed deeply in family, even when family brought pain. A man who trusted that love mattered, even when it failed to protect the people he cared about most. What makes his passing so difficult to process is not the absence of answers, but the absence of spectacle. There was no final transformation, no redemptive turn that wrapped everything into meaning. There was simply an ending that arrived without asking permission. And maybe that is why it feels so heavy. Because it mirrors real life more closely than any story ever could. Rob Reiner spent decades showing audiences that the most important moments often happen in stillness. A pause before a line is spoken. A look held a second too long. A truth left unsaid. And in a way, his life closed the same way. Without explanation. Without resolution. Just silence where a presence once existed. He was never interested in being remembered as flawless, only as honest. Honest about love. Honest about doubt. Honest about the limits of what one person can fix. And that honesty is what remains now. Not a headline, not a theory, but a body of work and a life that accepted complexity without trying to defeat it. When the lights go out and the questions remain unanswered, all that's left is the impact someone had while they were here. And by that measure, Rob Reiner didn't vanish. He stayed. In stories that still comfort, in lessons that still ache, and in the quiet understanding that some endings don't need explaining to be true.